As the gritty, gloomy 1970s faded in the rearview mirror, an opportunity for optimism and a clean slate emerged on the horizon. Perhaps this new decade would inspire great change that would leave all this fatigue, division, and stagnation behind. 1980 would be a fresh start, ushering in an era like no other. But of course, this appetite for a new way of life manifested in ways that created a lot of ambivalence. Much of this change took the form of unapologetic materialism and decadence, almost as if it were meant to compensate for how different things had been before. These unique circumstances have since given the 1980s a reputation for its lavish and gaudy culture, so much so that we tend to forget the many unique problems that the decade also created for its contemporaries. When we think of the 1980s, we often think of very specific characteristics. Bright neon colors, particularly with Olivia Newton-John inspired gym outfits, lots of denim, crazy hair, overly preppy outfits, and of course, new wave. Now that is obviously a non-exhaustive list of the stereotypical traits we tend to prescribe to the 80s, since we are talking about 10 years worth of culture in one video. But why? There are many ways to aesthetically express an excess lifestyle. So why did the 1980s look like that? What caused this specific style to show up at this time? Well, just like with any period in history, these reasons were typically related to political, technological, and socioeconomic factors of the time. Now, we are going to talk about them. Just like with my other videos on decades, I do want to make a disclaimer that, once again, I will mostly be talking about the 1980s as it appeared in the Western world. Additionally, I will be mainly discussing the most prominent and popular aspects of this time. I understand that there are no absolute truths when it comes to a topic as complex as analyzing decades, and that not everyone's experience is universal. With that said, buckle up, because where we're going, we don't need roads. We actually do need roads because cars in the 80s couldn't fly yet, and they still can't fly now. It's from Back to the Future. Now, what is with your hair, you might be asking? Why is your face like that? Well, because it's the 80s. Carter's finally out of office, music is on television, Lady Charles and Prince Diana are married. Get with the program, dude. But I do want to start this video with discussing fashion, because I think, in my opinion, it is an aspect of the 80s that arguably provides the most introspective look at pop culture, at least compared to more recent decades. Now, I've talked about the concept of decade overlap in the past, the idea that the look and feel of a decade doesn't immediately stop as soon as the calendar year changes. For example, the year 2000 was still pretty 90s, and 1970 was still pretty 60s. But what's interesting to me is that, at least based on my observations, the 80s does in fact feel like they pretty much started right away. Well, in most respects. Like with pretty much all decades in recent time, 1980s fashion did a lot of repurposing of the previous decade's fashion by essentially elevating it into something that they perceived at the time as more alive or even futuristic. A common base-level design trend among men at this time was sporting that Beatles mop-top style haircut that even dates as far back as the 60s, but carried well on into the 70s, and eventually the 80s as well. With the growing popularity of fast fashion from the previous decade, you see a lot of men wearing t-shirts, maybe sporting the occasional logo, typically for a company that was seen as new and their version of the future. Some popular examples include Atari, MTV, many sci-fi inspired designs like Space Invaders, just to name a few. I like to call this the Alex Keaton look, where the appearance is still a bit preppy and conservative, but leaves a little bit of room for some counterculture and new spin on things. You would also often see a lot of band t-shirts with this particular outfit ensemble, a thing that was also common in the 70s. But what really stands out are these futuristic designs. So where did they all come from? And why were they so popular at this specific point in time? It was a lot of things, but I think the biggest component of all was the rise of the personal computer. The 1980s are the decade of digital personalization. The IBM mainframes, the entire factories of yesterday, can now sit comfortably on top of your desk with a whopping 128 kilobytes of memory. And you get to call the shots at the end of the day, just like my Macintosh. It does everything I tell it to, except I'm not a fan of this new program that Apple seems to be shoehorning into everything. Mac OS? Xerox on line 3, it wanted SCUI back. Oh shit, sorry mom. Didn't know you were on the phone. What did she mean by 976 number? Anyway, I just downloaded some RAM and added a couple of ARPANETs, and I got Apple DOS running in no time. Right now, I'm playing Oregon Trail. Oh no! My character has contracted dysentery. Too bad back then they didn't have access to ZocDoc, today's sponsor. Thank you, President Reagan, for letting me advertise to children. ZocDoc allows you to search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors, all on a computerized network. Just choose the right one for your needs and instantly book an appointment. And the best part is that it's free. You can filter your search based on doctors that are in your area, what kind of reviews they have, or if their services are a good fit for what you medically need, ranging from mental health, dentistry, eye and skin care, and more. You can even filter your search for doctors that fit your insurance, because America is the only developed nation in the world that doesn't have subsidized healthcare. But don't worry, trickle-down economics will take care of that. It even shows you each doctor's availability, and you can choose the time that works for you right away. You can book these appointments up to 24 to 72 hours in advance, or even sometimes on the same day. It can all be done on your PC. You don't even need to talk to anybody. So visit my link down in the description and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Don't put off that appointment. Try ZocDoc today. PCs like the Apple II, the IBM, the Commodore 64, and the Macintosh allowed for everyday people to access incredibly sophisticated technology more than ever before. Were computers still relatively niche and only used by a minority of people? Yes, absolutely. But it did signify that something big was about to come. Machines that once took up an entire building, now being able to fit all on your desk was exciting enough on its own, and people wanted to express that. This is when you get the Apple II era of the 80s, a period which predominantly appears in the early part of the decade, but had its influence and roots form in the late 70s. Much of these science fiction-esque designs stem from the massive popularity of Star Wars, games like Space Invaders, and even just the emergence of arcade culture in general. This unique look and typography that these futuristic designs have took a lot of inspiration from 1950s sci-fi comic books, which used these exaggerated, strange, and glossy designs to boldly represent a depiction of the future that was foreign, yet still orderly and idealized. Naturally, this design just caught on, and with the emergence of personal computers, this only compounded. Now that aspect of the 80s focuses more on aesthetics than fashion, but things like t-shirts allowed for the two to mingle. Much of the early 80s still saw continued popularity of 70s facial hair, which also shares its roots in counterculture. Much of the more abstract but casual wear of this time sported very bright colors associated with a new design known as the Memphis style. It was created by Italian designer Ettore Sottsass in 1980 and was named after the Bob Dylan song Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again, as this song was playing while he came up with the idea. This is the main style that gave the 1980s that look. You know, the geometric shapes and neon colors that we would quickly associate with this decade as well as the first half of the 90s. The very primitive stages of computer graphics allowed for more generic and abstract designs to enter the mainstream. And these vibrant colors were essentially a counter-response to the aesthetic of the 70s, like the prominent harvest gold, avocado green, and drabby brown colors. Now, of course, this was a design mostly seen in pop culture rather than in everyday life, where much of these duller colors did stick around. But this certainly highlighted it as a new form of counterculture art that was now slowly entering the mainstream. As we've seen, when a new decade comes along, it introduces things that try to be different from the decade which preceded it, and the 80s was certainly no exception. Denim was already quite a popular fashion choice for a couple of decades. Its association with labor and hard work gave it a sort of tough, rugged appearance, with it then being appropriated by James Dean and greaser culture for this exact reason. Denim suddenly became cool to wear. Not to mention, it was cheap to produce. Combine this with the advent of designer denim. Created by companies like Guess Jeans, Levi's, and Calvin Klein, denim was now even being marketed as a luxury. Further reinforced by Brooke Shields' famous and controversial Calvin Klein ad from 1980, jeans were more popular than ever before. A niche yet still relatively popular fashion choice among women in the early 80s was the pixie look. This involved women with short, more masculine haircuts, a look that very much stood out to the trends of the previous decades. This is no surprise given that the pixie cut originates from 70s punk, which was specifically constructed to be incendiary and to upset the status quo. The most popular examples include the Ramones, Sex Pistols, Joy Division, and so on. Its confrontational and aggressive demeanor was an expression of the frustrations people had towards authority during the economic hardship and hot political tension of the 1970s. When you take this and combine it with this Memphis style we just discussed, you get that very distinct look that's commonly associated with women's fashion in the early 80s. The transformation this punk style underwent at this time can be attributed to three things: politics, technology, and entertainment. I think we often underestimate just how much politics has an influence on art, even art that may otherwise seem completely detached from it. I was actually just talking to a friend about this the other day, and I think you can certainly make the argument that virtually all of Western 1980s art and pop culture was, in some way, shape, or form, influenced by Reagan-Thatcher conservatism. It's easy to overlook through rose-tinted glasses, but I think a lot of people forget just how awful the 70s were. Now, the 70s will be its own separate video, so I will save all my detailed explanations for it then. But the end of the decade saw record-high inflation and economic stagnation, high unemployment, all-time high crime rates, air pollution, gas shortages, racial and gender inequality, the aftermath of the Vietnam War and Watergate scandal, the Iranian hostage crisis, just to name a few. You even see this gloominess and grittiness very prevalently in a lot of 70s art. For example, ever noticed how 1970s horror movies are just so much darker and so much more disturbing than horror movies from any other period, even from the decades after? You could make the argument that the intense turmoil of the time desensitized people to disturbing things, and therefore allowed them to more freely and more accurately express trauma. This would be a great example of politics influencing art. Now, of course, this is all speculation. In fact, what's interesting is that a lot of historians have made this observation about the 1970s, but it's still not fully understood why this happened. There are theories for why the 70s were like this, and again, I'll get to that when we discuss it later down the road, but all you need to know for now is that it was just not a good time for a lot of people. And with the 1980 US presidential election creeping up, a new decade gave way to new opportunities to turn things around. And one populist candidate was quickly personifying this. Although his policies are viewed very contentiously today, Ronald Reagan was largely seen as the healing that America needed at this time, the light at the end of the tunnel.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
He was charming, funny, optimistic, and to many of his contemporaries, his politics just made sense.
There you go again. When you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
The main idea which he was writing on was something called Reaganomics. Now, this is a very touchy political subject even today, so I will try to explain it from as many angles as possible. Reaganomics is essentially a philosophy that is built on a broader framework known as supply-side economics. Much of the post-depression US economy was operating on something called Keynesian economics, which emphasized government intervention to increase demand and therefore foster economic growth and employment. This typically involved increased government spending, some higher taxes, and more regulation. A lot of critics blamed this for much of the high unemployment and stagflation of the 1970s. Supply-side economics basically does the opposite. The idea was that if you lower taxes for corporations, these corporations now have more money in their pockets. Therefore, they can use that money to increase production and therefore increase sales. Now that they are making more money, they can afford to expand operations, which means they can hire more employees and even pay them higher wages. And with less government regulation, it is much easier for these companies to get things done. An exception to lower government spending was for the military, which actually saw increased funding. This was a more attractive policy during the Cold War. So not only do the corporations get richer, but some of that money also ends up coming down and reaching the working class as well. Everybody wins. Of course, this economic theory was not immune to criticism. Many of Reagan's opponents pejoratively called this trickle-down economics, as it suggested that the rich were getting so much richer while the working class just received the scraps that were left behind.
Additionally, Reagan also cut taxes for rich individuals, not just corporations.
Other critiques of this theory argue that corporations typically don't use the extra money to increase production, but instead they just hold on to it and therefore hoard their wealth. Precursors to supply-side economics were tried in the 1890s, referred to at the time as horse and sparrow economics. Many critics have argued that this was partially responsible for the Panic of 1896, but Reaganomics was one of the first government concepts to truly embrace and take on a much more refined, modern form of this theory. Reagan was able to persuade enough struggling Americans to support this theory, and had a landslide victory in 1980.
Ronald Reagan has won in the state of Texas with its 29 electoral votes. No Democrat has won the presidency without carrying Texas.
NBC News projecting Ronald Reagan, the next president of the United States, the 40th president, at 69 years of age.
It is a very complicated and controversial subject, which I think is best as its own separate video. Regardless of Reaganomics' efficiency, the economy did in fact recover throughout the 80s. And optically, this did make Reagan look quite good, which helped create an era of optimism for the time, which we do see in pop culture. British punk rock starts to transform into a more mainstream, upbeat, and electronic genre of music. Early technological innovations from people like Wendy Carlos and her debut album Switched on Bach from the late 1960s demonstrated that, hey, we can actually make music with electronics, not just instruments. This became a trend throughout the 1970s, and its prevalence would only compound with the popularity of personal computers. And so, New Wave is born. Obviously, these are not things that appear overnight. There is always cultural overlap. Heart of Glass by Blondie was released in 1979, but in my opinion, it does sound like a very 80s song. Meanwhile, Michael Jackson's Off the Wall album, which came out that same year, is basically your quintessential 70s disco album. But as the political and atmospheric tone shifts, we start to see which cultural trends take priority. The upbeat sounds and vibrant visuals of things like New Wave and the Memphis style were aesthetic representations of these positive vibes of the time. But when you combine these things and take advantage of growing technology, you then end up with something truly incredible. Something that would essentially help define the entire decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
Now, I've done an entire video about cable television, but the long and short is that it was a new technology that not only gave people access to way more TV channels, but ones that had way less regulation. This allowed for MTV to become insanely popular, and was an outlet for artists to combine music and video, and to do so in a freely expressive way. The best way to see success in this new space is to grab the viewer's attention through unconventional and borderline provocative means. You start to see a lot of traditional gender roles being broken. Men wearing makeup and dressing very feminine, women dressing very masculine, like we just talked about earlier. Other ways to grab the viewer's attention was through crazy hairstyles. This allowed for 80s hair to become a thing, and the success of bands like Kiss and Aerosmith from the 70s proved that shock rock could be transformed, and you get glam rock and hair metal. But one artist in particular not only mastered this appeal to androgyny, but also took the concept of the music video to a whole other level. Michael Jackson. Now, Michael was already a huge celebrity by the end of the 1970s, due to his history with the Jackson 5 and his newly released debut solo album. But his innovations throughout the 1980s not only made him essentially the face of the entire decade, but one of the most influential musicians of all time. During this new era of music being fully expressed through visual means, Michael's incredible singing, songwriting, dancing, and mesmerizing outfits immediately stood out to anybody watching MTV. Additionally, his music videos were basically entire movies. The TV premiere of Thriller was like the Super Bowl, one of those unforgettable events that would define an entire generation. His unique music and appearance as the king of pop would no doubt also have an influence on the culture of the time. Other artists like Prince had a very similar approach and style, with several hits like his self-titled debut album, 1999, and Purple Rain. I think it's very fascinating just how cognitively dissonant of a decade the 1980s were. I've talked a little bit about this in the past on my channel, but it really is something that pops up a lot at this time. Despite being quite a conservative time, even relative to the counterculture era of the 60s and 70s, much of 80s pop culture was arguably the most liberally expressive the modern world had seen up to that point. It does seem a bit contradictory that much of this art that we typically associate with LGBT culture also comfortably existed in a time that was historically very unaccepting of gay rights. However, the situation is also a bit more nuanced than it may appear at face value. The 1980s were certainly a time where people were getting more accustomed to gay people and gay culture, but frankly, still hadn't fully decided on how they felt about it. A great example of this would be the Reagan administration. Many historians today critique Reagan's indifferent attitude to handling the AIDS epidemic as something that was rooted in homophobia. But at the same time, Reagan was from Hollywood and had several friends who were gay and had gay people in his administration. He even opposed California's Briggs Initiative in 1978, which aimed to ban gay and lesbian people from teaching in public schools. Even if these stances were purely politically motivated, there is no doubt in my mind that Reagan was not the only person at this time feeling a lot of ambivalence towards what was a new and touchy social issue. And I believe this would absolutely influence the art of the time, even to a subliminal degree. While anti-gay sentiments were still very alive and normalized at this time, it still definitely was a more accepting time relative to the previous decades. A gay person could exist more comfortably in the 1980s than they could have in the 1950s. But on the other hand, a lot of people at this time also just didn't associate this campy art with gay culture either. In fact, a lot of these androgynous men even became sex symbols in their own right, and were even considered very attractive among women. A lot of it was just motivated by grabbing people's attention visually through a new medium like MTV. Another example of politics and technology's influence on art that I particularly find interesting is with 80s television and film. Aside from just MTV, cable culture and the laws that surrounded it allowed for other new aspects of TV to become big as well. This ambition to stand out and be provocative in a world of chaos and confusion popularized a lot of experimental comedy, both observational and downright absurd and almost avant-garde, the kind of stuff that just seems nonsensical at face value. The Federal Trade Commission Improvements Act of 1980 was a turning point for television. It effectively curtailed most regulation towards advertising to children. And this was during a time where merchandise culture was growing insanely popular thanks to the success of Star Wars. As a result, children were suddenly a whole new market companies could profit from. And so you see an explosion in children's media.
And the masters of the universe.
This would coincide with the launch of the first ever cable channel dedicated to children's entertainment. This is even a pattern that you start to see in film at the time as well. The rise of the coming-of-age genre. One of the most prominent variations of this is something that would become known as the Amblin style. Named after Spielberg's studio Amblin Entertainment and the popularity of E.T., these are the films that typically focus on groups of teenagers embarking on an adventure, usually one that is whimsical or involves searching for an identity. Other popular examples of this include The Goonies, Stand By Me, The Outsiders, The Breakfast Club, The Gremlins, and Back to the Future. This is very much the format that period shows like Stranger Things takes its inspiration from. This new movement of making entertainment geared towards children was certainly a motivation for it, but so was this growing sense of nostalgia. We've talked about the 30-year rule in the past on this channel. In the 90s, people were predominantly nostalgic for the 1960s and a little bit of the 70s, but in the 80s, 50s nostalgia was all the rage. But it wasn't even just nostalgia for a particular time, but also a nostalgia for childhood innocence altogether. It's important to remember that Cold War tensions elevated in the 80s, and these Amblin-style films provided an escape for many viewers to look back on a time where childhood imagination took priority over real-world problems.
I wouldn't let anybody hurt you. We could grow up together, E.T.
Which brings me to what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the 80s. It was arguably the era of the shared experience. Television in general has always had the power to connect us all together in real time. But with the rise of cable, there was so much more content to consume. But not too much to the point where it feels like each person is just in their own little media bubble. It was just enough for someone to still have a choice while being able to experience something with lots of other people. There were so many times where history was made and the earth stood still to watch it happen live.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin from NBC News. Former Beatle John Lennon is dead. Lennon died in a hospital shortly after being shot outside his New York apartment tonight.
Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States, suffered a wound in his left chest from a single .22 caliber bullet.
It'd be hard to call what we've been through fun, but I'm sure glad we went through it together.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Engines at 65%. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union again tops this edition of Metro News 6.
Mount St. Helens was visible for the first time in 2 days this morning, and geologists say that she is erupting more violently now.
And here now, the Prince and Princess of Wales.
These aren't mine. I can kick.
You're a
pero. All right.
We shall prevail.
It was television that allowed everyone to experience the 80s together at the same time. But of course, we're still talking about billions of people over a 10-year period, each from a different background, with different beliefs and different lives. All the reasons I just gave for why the 80s looked like that are not absolute. The truth is, there's no single straightforward answer, and we'll probably never know all of them. There's so much stuff throughout history that goes undocumented that we're left no other choice but to analyze complex things using our most popular theories and educated guesses. It is the art of understanding each other more clearly and therefore bringing us closer together. If you would like to learn more about the shared experience, you can watch my video about the history of cable television right here. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters, patreon.com/nationsquid, and feel free to buy me a coffee as well, because that coffee will trickle down to you, my viewers. Okay, thanks for watching.